policy. Also, welcome everyone to our webinar this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mike DeGeer, Vice Chair with Advocates for Public Education Policy, also known as A4PEP. We are a statewide organization representing grassroots groups across the Colorado, and we work to educate the public and policymakers to support and protect public education. We are very excited to hear from our speaker, Josh Cowen, who will share some very important information about school vouchers. Even though Colorado voters defeated vouchers at the ballot box 3 times, there is now a new federal tax credit voucher that Congress passed last July. Our governor, Jared Polis, opted Colorado into this plan, and all but one of the Republican-led states have also opted into it. At our last webinar in January, we heard from local and national experts about the many problems inherent in this federal voucher bill and how some Colorado legislators are trying to provide guardrails for this plan. If you haven't seen that webinar, you can watch it on our website, a4pep.org. Tonight's webinar will also be available on the website in a few days. Josh Cowen will give us a history of the voucher movement and provide more information about its origins and the impacts that vouchers are having today. At the end of our program, we also will be joined by one of our state legislators, Representative Lori Goldstein, who is sponsoring a bill with her colleagues to provide more guardrails for the federal voucher plan before it becomes effective in 2027. Josh Cowen is a professor at Michigan State University and the author of The Privatize, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. His book is a very comprehensive review of the research on vouchers and the effects that vouchers have had in states where they've been enacted, as well as the ideological underpinnings of this movement. I recommend it highly. Josh is a nationally recognized expert and writer on topics related to school choice, teachers and teaching, policy analysis, and education politics. He's been interviewed by many major media outlets, and he testifies across the country on the dangers of school privatization, and he's been regularly quoted in state and national feature reporting. He recently joined a podcast with Heather Cox Richardson, a historian who's helping us make sense out of our current precarious political climate. I will be having a discussion with Josh. We'll have some time for questions and answers from the listening audience at the end. Feel free to place your questions or comments in the Q&A section. We will try to address as many of those we can at the end of our discussion. Welcome, Josh, to our A4PEP webinar, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. Let me begin by asking you, why did you feel compelled to write the book, The Privatize, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers?
Well, again, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to see you all, or to join you all from Michigan. I have been working on school voucher evaluations or I had been going into the book for a very long time, back to when I was a young grad student in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, working on voucher evaluation. Scientific research trying to evaluate whether these things were working in a pilot phase in a handful of states. Most of those evaluations were run by voucher advocacy organizations. Most of them, as I wrote in the book, were done, as far as I could tell, correctly. So no one, at least I wasn't accusing anybody of cooking the data or anything like that. But they were tiny, and they were in small scale, and they didn't show a lot. Occasionally, they showed something worked for kids in terms of test scores, but like this was no child left behind era, and so all the public schools were having to report their results. And in that time, in that spirit, most of the voucher programs had to as well. Fast forward to about a decade ago, when these programs started to scale up to statewide. So what we do in the research community, like a lot of things, you test something in one city, a few hundred kids, and if it seems to go okay, or at least isn't objectionable, you've got strong advocates pushing for it to expand, it goes to a statewide level or a citywide level, whatever. When that happened for vouchers 12 or so years ago, the results became horrific. Some of the worst results we've ever seen on any question in the history of education research. The students who used vouchers to transfer to private schools did terribly on the state exam. We can talk about why that is, but that was the fact. Some just really, really bad numbers.
Yeah.
Moved on to other things because they were so bad. A number of us sort of trying to build out. I was building a center that was a partner with the state of Michigan. I was trying to do other things. Um, and then fast forward again to 2022, 4 years ago, March of 2022, actually, almost 4 years ago exactly. I got a call from NBC News asking me, about some new voucher bill that Betsy DeVos was trying to push from in my state. And honestly, I kind of said, why in the hell are we having this conversation still? I wasn't rude to the reporter. Does good work, but it's kind of these things are supposed to be dying. And I know that Arizona and a handful of states were pushing them out a little bit or trying to, but like the results had been terrible going into COVID. Um, Little did I know that we were starting this like what's now turning into a 4 year push and onward for vouchers. And that interview with NBC News turned into another interview and a column and more op-eds. And eventually I ended up just saying, I'm going to write a book and explain what's going on here and why this is happening. And so that's what I did.
Well, it's a very powerful study, and I think it not only covers the research that you just referred to, but it also speaks to who's behind this movement. Can you talk a little bit about who are the billionaires, since that's the title of your book there, it's in
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
and the organizations behind the movement to use vouchers to privatize education, and what are their long-term goals? I mean, what's this all about?
Well, the real origin story for vouchers, you got to go all the way back to the months after Brown versus Board of Education. So this young 42-year-old economist, conservative economist named Milton Friedman, had been working on this paper called "The Role of Government in Education," where he basically was arguing for vouchers. But he had started that paper before Brown was announced. But we now know through the historical record, and I talk about this in the book that Friedman's editors pushed him quite a bit on, you can't just throw this thing out there saying parents should get coupons to go to private school in the wake of Brown v. Board. Everyone's going to think you're proposing a way to avert Brown. And sure enough, what Friedman said in a series of famous or infamous footnotes in that paper was basically, hey, you know, I abhor segregation, but I equally abhor, this was Friedman's words, not mine, I equally abhor forced integration.
Hmm.
And these vouchers allow us to avoid all of that. Parents can choose what they want. If they want to choose a segregated school, let them. If they want to choose an integrated school, let them. Um, that didn't land, that did push a few southern state legislatures to kind of propose voucher bills and even try to pass a few of this unfortunate phrase segregation academies started to be enter the southern popular lexicon, but they didn't really come into like their modern form until 1990. And a handful of right-wing organizations, most notably a group called the Bradley Foundation, which is a big funder of right-wing politics today, funded Stephen Miller in between the two Trump administrations, based in Wisconsin, sort of got some votes together to push a new pilot voucher program. At the same time, the Charles Koch's network, not the Charles Koch's network, the Koch brothers, but specifically Charles Koch, who was a big benefactor of Milton Friedman's, and Betsy DeVos, who was fairly young at the time, but became a big sort of philanthropist and Republican Party activist. Served 2 terms as the Republican state party chair in my state. Kind of all these organizations, for their own reasons, were pushing vouchers, all of which related to defunding public schools for their own separate reasons. Um, and that it's been a long, long project. But those are sort of you get the kind of frankly the Christian nationalist billionaires headed by Betsy DeVos, the kind of libertarian types headed by Koch, and then the new flavor actually is the Elon Musks of the world and Jeff Yass, a TikTok billionaire. So you do have some new tech bro billionaires, I call them, getting into vouchers again for their own reasons. The through line between all of those billionaires is just deep hostility to public schools in general, and not unrelated, deep hostility to labor unions. That's the thing that like Betsy DeVos spends a lot of time worried about bathrooms and books, which books kids are reading and banning books and all that business. The Koch people don't care about that. They really don't. But what unifies them is deep hostility to public schools in general and deep hostility to labor unions in particular.
Why was there such deep hostility to public schools? I mean, what we've learned is that people like John Walton, for instance, started his own children's scholarship fund and the ACE scholarship in around that same time, around late 1990s, because they said the public schools were failing certain students. I mean, is that where the hostility came from? I understand the labor union piece, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, we have to be honest, and I've said this a lot more recently I've seen a lot of polling recently on this issue in general. Like, we have to be honest about where public schools have not always lived up to the bargain.
Yeah,
And that is especially true, frankly, in communities of color, in lower income communities, in many rural communities. Now, that's not to say that that schools aren't providing other important services, and especially in those rural communities, but not always doing maybe we would want them to in terms of particularly in serving at-risk children, right? And we can talk about why that might be in terms of being underfunded chronically, but
right.
I mean, I don't listen. I mean, I have been around, and if you go to some school districts, they make you feel like you're a pain in their butt if you're advocating for your kids, say IEP or 504. And there actually is a component of the activist community on the voucher side that really got themselves energized specifically on that issue. They really felt they were being very poorly served for their children of special needs through the public school system. Now that's not to say vouchers provide a solution to that, but that was the energizing force originally for some of these folks, including on the Walton side. Um, but I just to kind of simplify, and then I'll shut up and we'll let you follow up. But for Betsy DeVos and Charles Koch in particular. So Betsy DeVos she has said this publicly. She laments the what she sees as the central place of public schools in communities across the country. She wants churches to be the central place in communities across the country. I would actually sort of take issue with the idea that in many communities churches aren't the centers of community. I think this is kind of
Mhm.
inventing a crisis for these people. But that's what she said, and she sees vouchers as a way to move public schools, away from the centers of community and replace them with churches and church-based organizations. For the Koch people, it's a little bit like that, except they don't care about churches. They see public schools and they see government. I mean, they want to privatize everything, post offices, air traffic control, whatever it is, because historically the Kochs dating back to their father, Fred Koch, they see government, they see regulation, they have applied many of the same arguments and think tank sort of processes of standing up scientific information that they learned during the oil and gas uh, buildup of their side of the firm,
Right.
trying to get climate change deregulated, things like that. They see public schools as part of that same problem.
Well, you kind of inferred this when you were talking about the problems that public schools have. Is it Christopher Rufo and some of the right wingers say
Sure,
that to get universal school choice, you need to operate from a premise of universal public school distrust.
sure.
And that has been a key element of pushing the voucher movement because somehow public schools are failing. So we have to have a different alternative to push kids out of public schools into other alternatives. And yet, vouchers continue to never be supported across the country. So where is that disconnect in terms of this opinion of how public school parents feel about their schools and about taxpayers feel about their public schools?
Yeah, that's a good point. So vouchers have never survived a statewide ballot initiative, including in your state, right? In 24.
Right.
Right. Um, Whoop, you there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Um,
Are
yeah,
you there?
I'm here. Sorry. So vouchers have never survived a statewide ballot initiative. It's true that when you put this to voters, including in rural communities, which is really important. So the same day that the voucher initiative was put up for vote in your state in November 24, it also nosedived, actually by much wider margins than in Colorado, in the famous liberal havens of Nebraska and Kentucky. Um, Voters don't like these things, which is why it takes billionaires to push them. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you. But part of it is because, like, I don't know that, listen, I'm no James Carville or whatever, but like, I don't think you have to be like a political strategist to see what's going on here. If people don't really internalize how something like vouchers helps them, unless they are already in private school, and that's one of the big data pieces that I almost embarrassingly helped contribute to the current conversation, which is just the simple observation that we've known in the research community since 2007 that by far most voucher users were already in private school even before taxpayers picked up the check. And so the constituency for these things does exist, but they generally tend to be for families who are already in private school. And that does include some small percentage of families with children with special needs who did find a way to a private school that did take them. But you don't see this mass exodus of families from public schools despite some general dissatisfaction. The Christopher Rufo thing, I just want to say, he did say that, and that it's important to remember all this is strategic, but that is why you do hear voucher advocacy organizations kind of paying a lot of lip service to help for students with special needs and to just
Yeah.
generally speaking, the COVID closures, frankly, did do some damage to the kind of general, um, argument in favor of public schools, mostly disingenuously, but there was some truth to some of what was said. Rufo mostly used race and to some extent gender. And so he specifically tried to create universal distrust for public schools around teaching like CRT, so-called critical race theory, so-called DEI, stuff like that. Really just trying to work up, frankly, a lot of parents about those issues. You really can't tell the story, by the way, just going all the way back to Brown of vouchers without telling the story about race, whether
Yeah.
back in 54 or now. Um, uh, I'll just sort of say as a data point for how made up half this stuff is, though, like Betsy DeVos's book "Hostages No More," very grim title that she released a couple of years ago. I read it, so you don't have to. Actually, right as I was finishing my book, I did include some thoughts about hers in mine. But she has an entire chapter supposedly dedicated to the horrors of the COVID-19 pandemic and the unions keeping schools closed. Um, in that chapter, 8 out of 30 pages is devoted entire. This is the chapter on COVID in Betsy DeVos's book. 8 out of the 30 pages in that chapter are devoted to the evils of DEI as she sees it. So some of this is just BS, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, this is somebody who was at a very senior level of government during the once in a generation
Right.
pandemic and whose entire portfolio was around public schools. She could have actually written an important and interesting chapter about that. She was, to be fair, I guess, on record pretty early, earlier than Trump himself, on the need to reopen schools. But she chose to spend, a third of her time in her autobiography talking about DEI instead of the COVID
Well,
pandemic. So a lot of this is just BS.
and she also had her own goals, as you pointed out, to
Sure.
bring the church and the religious element back into public schools, or at least get the
Yeah, yeah,
kids
yeah.
out of those public schools and bring them into religious schools. Let me probe a little bit further about the billionaires. I mean, what is it that they do to somehow get voucher legislation in so many states? Can you be specific about how what? I mean, look at Texas, for instance. Texas is going to have one of the largest voucher state systems. I think it's $1 billion, they're saying. How did that happen when the voters say no? What
Yeah.
what what game plan do these billionaires have that make this somehow law in 22, 20 some odd states?
Yeah. Well, it's dearly won, or it costs an insane amount of money for them to do this, and
Yeah,
they have the money, but it costs them dearly. Um, the they do it in two. So the dollars buy two things. So the DeVos organization, there's a C4, a 501(c)(4) called American Federation for Children,
right.
and they have state affiliates, probably including in yours. I don't know if they're in L50, but they have state affiliates. They about a year and a half ago, CNN got a hold of us of an investor slide deck and wrote an article about this. You can read. Um, in the just trying to get donors to this organization, and they said in this slide deck that they had spent $350 million over the last several years on lobbying activity for vouchers and got back $3.5 billion in taxpayer funding for vouchers across the country. That's about
Wow.
$100 in taxpayer funding for every dollar these billionaires have put into lobbying for it, which is a great rate of return if you're these guys, right? So some of it's just garden variety political lobbying. Like we don't have to, we have a system that in both parties are part of it, right? But like we have a system where pay to play is sort of the name of the game. One of the things that I've encouraged, and I don't know, I know we have a legislator coming on. One of the ways to think about this is just like garden variety lobbying in a state capital that happens every year on many issues. Legislators
Yeah.
meet, lobbyists help write these bills. It's one reason we have all these vendors, by the way, that are helping to oversee and administer voucher programs. It's not because we need them or we had them historically, but it's just I've been to state capital. This happens all the time. Vendor comes in, writes into the legislation why they need a vendor to administer some new cash subsidy. It's really just a typical. This is the private school families want their subsidy. I mean, in
Yeah.
my state, it's fishing. We all the fisheries industries, and I love fishing. But they come in, they say we need more money to help tourism, and they get it. And that's what happens with vouchers. The other thing that they do, though, and this is what my book was really focused on, is the DeVos organizations and the Koch organizations have, over the last 30, 40 years, spent tons of money. We don't know exactly how much on building think tanks.
Think
And
tanks.
these think tanks create they what we in my line of work call inventing a literature. They just create a case out of thin air for a particular policy goal, whether it's vouchers in this case. Um, they create pilot versions. You mentioned John Walton. John Walton, that children's scholarship program had three state-based affiliates in Dayton, Ohio, New York City State, and Washington D.C.
Right.
And they used data and evaluations, including stuff I worked on in those early years in 2001, 2002. They used data from those to argue to these were privately funded by John Walton and others, but it was a trial, clinical trial type thing, where they use data from those privately funded programs to argue to policymakers for why they should publicly fund vouchers in these places. And then they hire sympathetic researchers. And the model is the Heritage Foundation is the most famous of these think tanks, but there's many others through what's called the State Policy Network. I don't know that I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the one in Colorado. You They usually have weird names that are based on the state. So in my state, it's the Mackinac Institute. In Arizona, it's the Goldwater Institute. Which
We have several. Well, we have an
okay,
affiliate of 50 Can. We have Transform Education Now. We also have
yeah,
Colorado Seeds. There's several organizations that put out papers that push
same
the
idea.
same narrative that you're talking
Yeah, yeah,
about. And,
yeah, yeah,
and
same idea.
yeah, and I guess the other piece, though, you're talking about the think tanks. What about the buying of the legislatures, like they did in
Yeah,
Texas? Talk about
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, so in Texas, Texas was a long holdout for vouchers. So was Tennessee. Again, highly rural states. Texas obviously has some massive cities, but very rural. Republicans generally have not liked these things.
Right.
And then over the last handful of years, what the DeVos organizations in particular, they're very politically sophisticated. They changed their strategy from um, trying to just like win everyone to targeting and micro targeting on the fence rural Republicans. And this is where Trump and MAGA really comes into this because the voucher results were so bad 10 years ago that
Yeah.
like good faith Republicans who believed in good governance, fiscal conservatism, the use of taxpayer dollars in a transparent way, really hated vouchers. And it really caused a problem for their push. Like it almost died. The voucher movement almost died. Um, but but Trump made data and facts malleable, at least in the political discourse. And
Matt
he
Label.
also made, yeah, others have written about this. Heather herself, you mentioned Heather Cox Richardson, she's written about this. Jane Mayer's written about this. Others have written about this. But basically, Trump started to say the quiet part out loud for a lot of some of the conservative organizations that were pushing for this, especially on the issues of race and gender. And so Trump couldn't do a lot himself formally in his first term to uh, push vouchers through in a legal way. But when the test score results became so bad in late 18, 19, heading into COVID, in this narrative, Christopher Rufo barely ever talks about test scores. He talks about race. He talks about DEI. He talks about, Betsy DeVos spends half her time talking about bathrooms, not vouchers per se. They started saying stuff that like most of us 10 years ago would have like, what is wrong with these people? Right. And now it's just part of like the political discourse. And so into that environment, you get all these organizations spending big to primary out longstanding rural Republican legislators in places like Texas
Yeah.
who no longer can hold their own by just being a good steward of the public trust for years and years and years and delivering for their district. They now get primaried by some complete like Twitter goofball who happens to have big dollars from Betsy DeVos that's like 5 times what that longstanding good faith rural Republican legislator had to compete with.
Yeah.
And then Trump gets on the phone, and he actually did this before the voucher bill went up for a vote in Texas, where I testified against it last year. Trump got on the phone and told those legislators, you better damn vote for it. Like, even with all of that activity, spending to change the composition of the legislature, it barely squeaked through
Yeah.
until Trump himself got on the phone. So you really can't if you can't tell the long-standing, decades-long story of about vouchers without talking about race, you can't talk about the more recent push without talking about Trump and Trumpism. He
Yeah.
really made it easy to just BS your way through bill passage.
Well, the Trump movement around this issue has some allies, though. Moms for Liberty, for example, and some of
And
these
that's
other
the
groups.
Heritage Foundation. But yeah, sure.
Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, Lindsey Burke, and the Tiffany Justice with Moms for
Yeah, all
Liberty.
these people.
They supposedly say they want to have zero kids in public schools within 5 years, which,
I mean,
is that even realistic? And not that you need to comment on that, but I want to shift to the current challenge we have across the country with this Republican approved federal tax voucher.
yep.
Why did the Republican Congress sneak this thing in, so to speak? Why did they pass the current federal tax credit school voucher bill? And were these same groups the ones behind that? I mean,
Yeah, well, they've really maxed out in terms of that state-based strategy I've described. Like, there's
okay.
just not very many more pieces on the board for them to play. I mean, I'm not going to say never, but frankly, who knows? Your governor might decide to sign a state version, but it would be one of the few left.
Yeah.
The strategy of priming out, and like in a lot of these red states, even they don't just need a majority; they need a super majority to get vouchers through. So there's just not very many states left. They've really done everything they can, and so that's where this push a couple of years they anticipated that, and that's where this push at the federal level to push these things through. What was passed in the big beautiful bill is a lot weaker and frankly has a handful of provisions that at least in theory could be helpful to public school students
Right.
in ways that didn't exist in the original federal legislation that they had when they introduced the big beautiful bill. That what they wanted was a much bigger tax shelter for billionaires.
That was
And
ECA.
they
Yeah.
Yeah, ECA. And it would have been a standalone bill, and they wanted, but it would have been much harder for guys like you and me to take advantage of it in terms of a tax credit. It would have been big payoff to people like DeVos. In fact, one of the nonpartisan research centers in Washington calculated like how much people like Betsy DeVos and others would have made off of that thing. Um, but they didn't have the votes even in the Congress controlled by Mike Johnson and whatever the guys, John Thune in the Senate. They didn't have the votes for that, so they wanted to stick it in reconciliation. This is like super nerdy stuff.
Yep.
Sticking it in the budget reconciliation meant they didn't need veto proof. They could just pass it through, and tying it to all of Trump's other priorities meant that it bought votes from skeptical Republicans that it wouldn't have otherwise in a standalone bill. But to keep it in reconciliation, there's a long-standing rule that you can't just cram crap into reconciliation. I mean, at least you're not supposed to, and some crap gets in, but the parliamentarian gets to choose. When they stuck this piece of this ECA garbage into the big beautiful bill, the parliamentarian threw it out at the last minute. And at that last minute, they pushed forward a much more watered down version that instead of requiring states to do it, they gave this opt-in provision. And then they tweaked it a little bit to provide some, again, theoretical opportunity for public school students. And they needed to do that to keep it in reconciliation. And so that's the general, that's where we got this kind of weird hybrid thing that kind of
Right.
is hard to
But this was still being proposed by those same groups. Is that right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The same groups that
Absolutely.
pushed the state
For
vouchers.
sure.
Okay.
100%.
So let's talk about the meaning of this particular bill. The White House is calling it, well, they've also changed the name. They're calling it the Education Freedom Act. It used to be called the Federal Tax Credit Scholarship. They're not
Yeah.
using the word voucher in any of their messaging. In fact, the commentary from pro-voucher groups insists that it's not a voucher, but simply a tax credit. Yet in the congressional record, in the congressional report, it says as follows: these scholarships may also be referred to as vouchers. So would you shed some light on that issue and why is that being communicated that way? And is it a voucher?
Um, it's got a voucher inside it. There's a
Right,
lot of pieces to it that again I think had to be attached to it to get it through reconciliation.
right,
It would be disingenuous for me to kind of look at the whole thing collectively and say the whole thing is a voucher. It's not.
right.
But it does have a voucher inside it. There's no question about that. And what the White House marketing on this I find very perplexing, and it's a little bit like these guys are following a playbook that worked in 24 and maybe the first 2 or 3 months of the current administration were just everybody went and sort of was in such shell shock and kind of curled up in a ball and didn't want to fight Trump. And Trump has this the cracked the code in American politics and the rules don't apply and all this business, and we're seeing where that's not true anymore. I mean, some courts have stood up to him, some haven't, all that stuff. um but the reason I'm mentioning is that like a White House that was trying to actually get schools to adopt this, excuse me, states to adopt this, wasn't trying to strong arm them, wasn't trying to kind of make everything in the world about Trump, would be taking a much different approach to trying to sell this thing. It would be much
Yeah,
more coalition based, trying to work with there. Listen, there are because it can benefit some public school students. There are after school groups that are interested in this, tutoring organizations that are interested in this. They would be reaching to those people and trying to kind of again build a coalition to kind of what can we do with this? We've got purple states all over the place that have to. You've got to compromise, but that's not what they're doing. Instead, it's all Trump, 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 education freedom this, education freedom that, which is just code speak for vouchers.
right.
In particular, the freedom to do what? It doesn't give the families the choice. Vouchers, the schools get to do the choosing. But it does mean that, if you don't want to go to school, your kids to go to school around certain other children, you have the freedom to do it under the law. And that's what some of this stuff at least is about.
Well, let's dig into the specifics of it that maybe you can talk about, even though it hasn't been implemented yet. It won't be till 2027. How will the scholarship granting organizations, which are called SGOs, implement this tax credit as they award money to students? What are the guardrails going to be on the distribution of the money they receive? And will they actually decide to support public school tutoring needs, or is it going to be primarily going to the private school tuition scholarships like it has for 20 years
Yeah.
through ACE scholarships and Children's Scholarship Fund and all these other organizations that have been giving money right and left to push kids into private religious schools?
Yeah, it's a good question. The thing that makes so we're all waiting to hear what Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, does with the regulations behind this law. Um, Regulations can change because they're just regulations, but for now, under this administration, they will be effectively law until another administration takes over. I am surprised that Governor Polis decided to just blow through that waiting period and opt in without knowing any of the potential for the kinds of guardrails you use. We know that there are not going to be guardrails, for example, on the potential for discrimination. There's not really a mechanism under the fact they try to legislate against it in the legislation on the tax credit. For example, if you wanted to prevent an SGO from distributing money to families who were going to use those dollars at schools or tutoring organizations that matter that say discriminate against LGBTQ families. It's not clear to me. And I know we have a legislator coming on. It's not clear where the authority would be to do that, and that will probably get litigated. I assume states will pass such a law. Virginia has a nice bill out there too on something like this. It's not clear where we'll see that's probably going to get litigated. between a state will probably have to sue, or the feds will sue, and so on and so forth. The public school piece is a little bit less nebulous in the sense that you don't have to leave public schools to be eligible for the dollars. So by the same token, where it's not clear where the state would have the authority to put strings attached to the federal dollars, it's also not clear where the state would find the authority to exclude public schools from those dollars.
Yeah.
And there's some fight on the right about this. So the Davos organizations would prefer states take a sort of a maximalist approach to doing everything they can to exclude public school students from participating in this for tutoring, etc. But they also would prefer that the states take a minimalist approach to anything that smells like anti-discrimination. And they're willing to accept that public school students will participate in this if it means they don't have to worry about giving up their right to discriminate. And
Hmm.
so that's effectively a trade-off that's going to have to get made these dollars are going to come with a weird set of strings attached where like you kind of have to, no one's going to get everything they want out of that piece of legislation because of the way it got written into the bill. And so I think that is something where there's some other mechanical pieces that I don't want to bore you with that are
Yeah.
other also wait and see pieces.
Right.
But I'll just give an example. Like North Dakota, for example, they're doing two SGOs, and the one piece of authority states are going to have is to determine what is an SGO. It has to be under the law C3, a 501c3. It has to be a nonprofit that administers it. But the state treasury every year has to give a list of its SGOs to under the law to the treasury by, in this case, January 1 of 27 for your state. Well, the treasury will have some say over who is an SGO. In North Dakota, they've decided we're going to have a public SGO and we're going to have a private SGO. Private SGO is going to fund vouchers, tuitions. The public SGO is going to fund tutoring and whatever for these public school kids. What in theory makes it different is that most states you have to leave a public school to be eligible for the dollars. That's not true under this legislation because again, they had to accept that condition to get it through the reconciliation process.
Are you saying that North Dakota's idea of having separate scholarship organizations to support public school students and a separate SGO to support students who are going to attend private schools is going to be approved by Treasury, or do we know?
Well, we don't know if they'll be approved by Treasury, but that's their plan.
That's
And
their hope. Okay.
yeah, and the reason that matters, so the thing I'm most worried about with respect to how this could help or not help public school students actually isn't the legal piece. The law is pretty clear that it should be able to. What I am worried about is that the other side on this issue, the voucher people, are really good at networking and building around new law. And so they are already out there. Like, there's going to be a TurboTax drop down menu next year where you
Yeah.
can find any SGO in the country and just donate to it for your
Yeah.
person. If you want to donate to an after school SGO, a Catholic SGO, whatever, they're partnering with businesses to just take it out of payroll. Every $60 a paycheck adds up to what you can do each year and then have it sent to a partnership. The district, maybe the owner of the business likes Catholic schools. Maybe they like tutoring and after school programs for public school kids. I don't know. We're not our side on this in the public school community generally are not as we're good at building coalitions, good at building networks, but not maybe not as good at some of these public-private partnerships, business type arrangements that I think would be necessary to take advantage of it. So again, it's less. I'm less worried about formal legal barriers and more worried about like just kind of this is all new to public school advocates, whereas it is 30 years old for the private school folks.
Yeah. And I just have a couple more questions, and then I want to make sure we hear from our representative because the issue of discrimination is really a big concern, and you've already alluded to that a couple of times. These organizations, these SGOs, they also have what we would call tech platforms that administer this whole program. And there's a couple of them that are very active with the state voucher programs that are already moving forward. You mentioned American Federation for Children. They've hired Odyssey, which is a relatively new company, to
Christ, yes.
be their tech platform group that would then somehow take care of distributing the money to the families and administering the program. There are a lot of worries because these organizations are moneymakers. Can you talk
Yeah,
about
they
the
sure are.
profit piece? What about the profit piece that's going to happen with this whole system?
Until a couple years ago, I would have said the profit piece really wasn't a big part of this. Like Betsy DeVos and Charles Koch don't need more money, and they know they don't need more money. And the margins on education, even on the private side, have not been great. Like
Right,
we don't know exactly what they are for some of these for-profit entities, but it, providing like well, we haven't talked about micro schools. I'll leave that aside. Private equity has gotten into micro school business in part because taxpayers are now funding it through vouchers. But somebody's figuring something out here. Some of it could just be speculation. Those vendors that oversee those accounts, though, like the Odysseys of the world, Class Wallet's another one that
right.
they do. It is less ambiguous how they make their money. They make money by basically holding dollars in escrow and charging a major service fee. For
Right.
once they got their operation, and it took Odyssey a long time to not screw it up. They got a contract in Iowa, they got a contract in Missouri, they got a contract in Idaho, um, and
And they just got Texas.
they just got Texas, which is now that's just garden variety lobbying, like I said at the beginning.
Yeah.
They go and they send their guy down there and they plant the flag and then they get it into legislation. Either if not by name, it's written. There's an RFP that kind of you know what I mean. Um, but they I think they have figured out some of the quirks in this now, where they basically have a portfolio or a platform as you describe it that makes it fairly easy to process these things very quickly, and they charge a fee, and it does start to turn into big dollars.
Which is a concern because this is a money-making opportunity for people who, well, and let's be honest, Jeff Yass supported Odyssey. That's how they got their start. Jeff Yass, the man who also primaried the people in Texas, and they
They
also have money from Mark Anderson, the
Yes.
Silicon Valley man.
They have a lot of connections to the Catholic legal world too. So they've the the sort of legal framing behind all of this stuff comes out of
Yeah.
Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and a handful of others um, that have been working on this stuff for 30 years in the legal side, and the Odyssey folks are deeply tied to that network as well.
Yeah. I want to focus on your epilogue in your book, which to me was a key message, especially as it relates to our situation in terms of funding. You know, we talked earlier about the public schools not able to serve all students effectively, but many people would say, and you said it in your book, you said, I think it was the critical importance of funding schools. That's how you ended some of your comments. Can you expand on that? Why does it make such a difference? We are about to try and get a multi-billion-dollar deficit addressed through a graduated income tax ballot initiative this fall. So we want to know, how can we convince our public to vote for that? Because we've been so behind, $3 to $4 billion behind in the last 10 years in funding our schools. And
Yeah,
you stress that in your epilogue.
it's it's been a long time coming on the conservative side trying to stand up the argument that paying for schools doesn't pay off, which is a little bit ironic if you think about it because they do want you to pay for voucher schools. Um,
Vouchers for the wealthy.
yeah, right. It it I think it goes back to folks' general satisfaction, which unfortunately has been declining a bit in part because of all the political tax on public schools. And there's this general sense that we keep spending money and the results haven't changed. Um, but but some of this is that it's important to remember that public school spending that doesn't account for the increased cost, not increased public school spending. And so what happens is you get this sense that we're spending more and more every year historically. Governors like to take a victory lap in both parties, saying, I signed record increases in public school funding, and then 2 years later, when they want another increase, and people come back and say, yeah, but we don't see the results in our schools. Um, some of the reason for that historic spending is that costs are skyrocketing. I mean, how is a school? We got 4.99, 3.99, 4.99 a gallon of gas right now in my state because of this idiotic invasion of Iran. How many school buses that's going to triple, not triple, it's going to add 35%, 40% to the cost of just running school buses this month for public school districts, which comes out of school's bottom line, that comes out of your ability to educate your children in your
Yeah.
school district. So it's not magic. You get what you pay for, and that's true in public policy across the board.
Yeah.
And I never understand why we're supposed to kind of schools are supposed to do more with less, um, and why ask any business, ask John Walton, ask Jeff Yass or whoever. You have to spend money to have productivity, and that's true with public schools too. And you're going to get what you pay for. I
Yeah.
think one thing I would just add is that you know, we do know that funding public schools is very popular when it comes to your own school. It has been harder to convince voters overall at a statewide level to send dollars, the other side of the state or whatever. That's just a
Sure.
mechanical problem. It's not unique to schools. Um,
But the needs have increased significantly. You talked about transportation, also the needs to service students with disabilities, if you will,
who
and children
stay
with
in
English
public
language
schools when
learners.
vouchers come because vouchers don't generally take them. Yeah.
Vouchers what don't generally take children with disabilities? Is that what you
Yeah, I
said?
mean the schools get to choose the choosing. So there are schools that will admit students with disabilities, but they won't provide the
Yeah.
services, and then public
Yeah.
schools have to provide them.
Well, stay with us. Representative Goldstein, can you come on? I want to introduce one of our state representatives who has working with some other colleagues to propose some guardrails, if you will, on this federal tax voucher bill that we are dealing with. And you might tell us a little bit about that and what you're hoping to accomplish and what areas you're trying to, address. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mike. Josh, it's very interesting listening to you. We've been having a lot of conversations behind the scenes. We have proposed a bill, House Bill 26-1292, and we have likened a cliche analogy of we're building a plane while we're flying it in the fog. Because as you've said, the Treasury Department has not put the rules out yet. And quite honestly, if you think about this, it doesn't matter if Colorado opts in or not, because the taxpayer is going to be able to choose to send $1,700. And what taxpayer wouldn't want to decrease their taxes by $1,700? So what we want is our initial draft, if you've seen it, does have anti-discrimination in it, but we've been having a lot of conversations about probably taking that out or changing it because that's not going to fly at the State House. But what we do want is we just want to be able to have public school entities have a chance of getting some of this money. And so we've been talking to education foundations, and we're kind of landing on that kind of a spot of, and I like your idea, Josh, of what North Dakota's doing, of having a private SGO and a public SGO. And so I think we're kind of gravitating in that direction. We were supposed to have this in committee today, but we were able to push it out another week while we kind of gel to have something that by the time we propose it, not only will the education committee be accepting of it, because it's kind of hard sometimes to get things through the education committee and down the House, but we want the governor to sign it too. So that's kind of where we're going right now with our bill, is making it so that we ensure that there is a public SGO that will be available to take this money, and we'll send it to our
Well,
foundations to cover qualified under Coverdale.
yeah,
So
that's
yeah.
good. What was your concern about the discrimination aspect of the law?
Well, private schools don't have to take students that they don't want. And anti-discrimination laws say you will take every student.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that was our dilemma.
yeah. And that's a big, big issue, to say the least. Well, we really appreciate the work you're doing on that. I think Josh also made a very good point. The regulations are not yet complete. We still are waiting for Treasury to complete them. I thought your point also, Josh, about the fact that our governor opted in a little early, if you will, because there are 26 of the 27 Republican states have opted in, but only two Democrat-led states are in. And the one in Kentucky that is involved is because the Republican legislature overruled his veto of their bill. There's just 2 days ago. So we're dealing with politics, but we're also dealing with what are the needs of our public school students, which Governor Beshear really highlighted in his veto. Josh, the other thing I want to kind of get back at you around is the some of the questions that we've got in the chat. I just want to start with one of them. Maybe you can kind of respond to this. It says, would the corporate tech platform money managing model be a lot like Peter Thiel's PayPal? I don't know if you know how to know anything on that topic.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that. I would say there is money making to be had. I This is just my personal opinion. I I have for my part tended to emphasize the money making piece a little bit less, simply because if I'm honest, there's a lot of vendors in the public school world too, and every time this line of conversation comes up, I get somebody from the vendor world and the public school world saying, "Easy there, Tiger." When it comes to laundry services, transportation, I mean, the reality is there's a lot of money to be had in education, regardless. I I I am worried about it, but I think it's important to think of this as just creating a lot of new money in general, all to send more children to private school. And whether it's political capital that's being spent and received, whether it's literally financial capital, I mean, all of it is fundamentally about kind of shifting the way education is delivered in these states, even in the best case scenarios and I have great interest in trying to make these things work for public school students, again, because this is the first time that's happened. None of us would prefer this over just deep, sustained funding of public schools.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
what we all would want. But in a world where there's opportunity, we'd be foolish to say, let's just not give any public school students tutoring under this bill because just to die on that hill. I don't think that's the right move either.
The other thing that you mentioned in your book, you said, how come we don't have the same billionaire money like the left-wing Council for National Policy to help send the message about the fact that schools are doing well? How can that message of failing schools be countered? Since we don't have those think tanks, we don't have those money behind the Heritage Foundation. What can local citizens do? What can our organizations do to help spread the message that our public schools are doing well? Graduation rates, for instance, in Colorado have hit all-time highs in some of our schools and our districts across the state. And so this issue of failing schools seems a little contrary, except when you talk about these tests that they kind of throw our way.
Well, I would love to hear what Representative Goldstein has to say about this too, because I, and I don't want to, because I'm going to give a short answer and then shut up. But what I want to preface with is I'm not going after Democrats per se on this, but I will tell you I've seen a lot of polling, internal and external, that shows that a lot of Democratic voters have lost trust in Democrats on the issue specifically of schools. And one of the reasons for that isn't that there's broad disagreement with how Democrats talk about schools or there's broad disagreement with the need to invest in schools. There is actually strong support for doing it. It's that Democrats just don't talk about it as much anymore. Since 2020, the advantage in just talking about it is, there's been some really interesting studies on this recently in terms of campaign ads, direct mail, messaging on this. Public schools and education more generally is a top 10, top 12 issue for the average Democratic candidate. Now it's top 3 issue for Republicans. Now, what they mean when they talk about it is vouchers. But I think when you go out into the community, like Democrats are talking about a lot of things, and we need to in the Trump world, right? Like there's a lot of stuff, Medicaid and affordability and all that stuff. But public schools has gotten dropped down a lot further, and this is partly why it's it's been an uphill thing to make the case. Sometimes you just got to talk about it more.
Good point. Representative Goldstein?
Well, in Colorado, when it comes to public schools, our biggest issue is funding, and our biggest enemy is Tabor. And so talking about that is it's front and center right now. I
Yes.
mean, we're going to have a ballot initiative, hopefully, with graduated income tax. We have a bill where we're going to refer to the voters to eliminate the Tabor cap or seriously make it higher. And so on top of the fact that we are in declining enrollment, those kinds of things, I think some people who actually pay attention are finding out that we're coming to a perfect storm because our School Finance Act is based on how many kids we have, or how many butts and seats, so to speak. So all those things are coming to a head, and I think people are starting to pay attention, especially also with our state budget. in general. I mean, we have to cut almost $1 billion this year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think people that are paying attention are starting to pick up on that.
And I think they will be when those petitions get out around the initiative that to change how we're funding our schools. That's going to help raise the awareness of it. One other question, and then we'll open up for last comments. What strategies or actions can we use as citizens and public school supporters, advocates? What can we use to counter the far right as parents, teachers, and nonprofit groups? What strategies and actions? That was one of the questions being thrown out. Either one of you want to comment on that?
I'll take a stab at it.
Go ahead.
We had a rally yesterday at the Capitol for this ballot initiative. I was out enjoying the sunshine and watching it and listening. And a gentleman came over to talk to me, who I believe is leans more right. He's a right-wing blogger, and asked what I thought about that. And the question I asked him, I said, "Do you make over $500,000?" Which is where the increase in your income tax will be. So I think that's a great talking point.
Yeah.
Your taxes are going to go down if you don't. So hopefully that will resonate with our conservative friends.
Taxing the rich is what we're hearing. Tax billionaires, and those who make more need to be paying their fair share, which is what we've unfortunately been dealing with since 2017 when Trump changed the way our tax code was designed, and we've been hurting ever since. Josh, any last words from you in terms of both the voucher issue and this federal tax credit bill that we're dealing with across the country, and what you see as in the horizon? I mean, how's this going to work out? What's it going to look like? Who's going to win? Who's going to lose?
I think I would just sort of say in general the same things that we hear a lot right now across different issue areas, and that's that, you always have to fight these things that are important. Um, whatever gets decided on how to kind of deal with, manage, take advantage of, whatever phrase is for the public school side of this new federal thing. Like I think you just, some of that's just doing your duty, both in terms of like folks who care about your communities and civic activism, and also legislators. I mean, you can't walk away from dollars that could potentially help public schools, even if it's a bill that you don't love. But the long-term play here, like I vouchers are hemorrhaging what little support they had politically in Texas and Arizona right now. I've been dealing for like 2 weeks right now. There's gross misspending in Arizona, really predictable results. When I was in the well of the Texas legislature, getting just slammed by these Republicans and these DeVos lobbyists in testimony, um, saying what would happen is what did happen over the last couple of weeks in Texas. They have a political problem there because vouchers are deeply unpopular still. So just specifically on the private school tuition piece, people still hate it, and it's why it's taken so much money from the DeVosses, from the Yasses, from if listen, it's hard to do a ballot initiative. It's hard to do that. It's hard to get voters to approve anything when it goes to direct ballot. But like these people are particularly bad at it, which is why they have to spend so much money to primary out Republican legislators in particular. There's bipartisan opposition, especially in rural communities. And I think, I would just say, don't be afraid to build coalitions that you agree with people 85% with, instead of 100%, because we're not going to get there, without sort of welcoming people into the fold and sort of taking sort of different viewpoints on this. It may sound pie in the sky, but I do think this is an issue area where, there's a lot of opportunity to build some new coalitions against some of the bad stuff here, but it's going to take some creativity and a little bit of open-mindedness too.
I think you're making a good point. Rural Republicans are speaking up about this voucher issue across states. In Colorado as well as in Texas, there's very significant concern, and they just elected new state senators who were specifically against vouchers. That was part of their main campaign. Talarico, who got the nomination as a senator in Texas, was totally against vouchers. and rode that wave to beat his opponent in the primary there. And the same situation is going to happen, I think, in other places. We had rural Republicans who spoke up against the testing system we've been doing here in Colorado just the other day in our in education committee. They're very concerned about the pressures from the state and the money that's involved. The money that's involved is really hurting our local school districts. Good points, Josh.
I would say one last thing too, just in a really practical road, like for those rural Republicans, I don't know if I have any superintendents listening to us tonight, but the rural Republicans really listen to the superintendents in the districts that make up their districts. It was basically the Tennessee superintendents that helped stall vouchers in that state for years and years and years because those rural Republican legislators in the House and Senate in Tennessee just couldn't go against what was often basically the CEO or the largest employers in their districts.
Yeah.
So this is what I mean by kind of coalition building, and there's folks that really are the right messenger for some of these people, and I would encourage a lot of that kind of creativity.
Yeah. Please, those of you who are listening in, we will have this webinar on our website in a few days. I want to thank Representative Goldstein for joining us. We really encourage you to keep the fight up about helping support our public schools. And Josh Cowen, please buy his book, read his book. It's excellent. And it has a lot of good research information, but also some good messaging on what we can do to support our public schools. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We are right on time here. And we thank you for supporting Advocates for Public Education Policy, and check out our website. And we really appreciate everyone sharing their views tonight. Thank you again, Josh and Representative Goldstein.
Thanks, Representative.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, have a good one.
Thank you, everyone. We'll close down.